compound situation. I sort of had a distinct experience with my parents and a distinct experience with my grandparents, which were not the same. There were some similar sort of overarching components, but they were also very different. But the sort of overarching threads that stick with me, one, was that I always saw people working a lot and working hard. So whether that was they were literally in the fields, planting crops, pulling crops, harvesting crops, like all of those sorts of things with my mama and papa, or my parents who were primarily working blue collar jobs. You know, my dad was a truck driver for a while. He worked at a local lumber yard. My mom was an administrative assistant at a couple of places, and then spent the bulk of her career working at a gas station / grocery store. And so they were working odd hours, they were working shift work, all of them, all four of them. And so I sort of learned this philosophy of you work hard and you work a lot. And so that was beneficial to me as a child because I thought, okay, well, I have to do stuff too, right? And so the other sort of overarching message there was I heard repeatedly, both from my parents and grandparents, was you have to get an education to have a quote unquote good life. And so I understood that they didn't have those opportunities. My maternal grandparents, my mom and papa, stopped out of school in middle grades because they needed to work on the farm. So they had middle grades education. My mom stopped out in high school, but got her GED. And then my dad got his high school diploma. Only one of my four grandparents graduated from high school, my mama, my dad's mom, and she went to the same high school I went to. So I still have her tassel. We graduated from the same high school. So that's a pretty cool and important sort of fact for me. But I sort of understood, you know, you need to have an education to have a good life. They impressed on me that school was important and grades were important. And I also knew that if I ever wanted to go to college, we didn't have the money for that. And so grades were especially important, not only to get in, but also to fund sort of my educational pursuits. So I sort of knew that they didn't get to have this thing and they had to work hard and work a lot. And so I think both of those sort of threads have followed me into my life because I did get to have an education. I do get to have sort of a more economically stable life than anybody in my family has got the opportunity to do. And I still work hard and work a lot. And so it's interesting. And now my mom sometimes will be like, you know, I'll be like, oh, I need to go home and I have these, you know, assignments to look at and all these other stuff. And she'll always be like, why do you give him so much work? It makes you have so much work. And I want to be like, I learned that from y'all, right? Like y'all are the people I learned that from. And then I think the other important sort of like third thread I learned from really all like both sets of my grandparents and my parents was that they were very engaged in their community. And so my grandfather would do trades, like crop for crop trades with other farmers. And they were, you know, my mom volunteered at a local church. My dad was a local volunteer firefighter. And so they were engaged in their church communities. They were engaged in their friend communities. They were engaged in our small town. And so they were sort of helping things run and function and all of those sorts of things. And so this idea of community and communalism and those elements, I think, stayed with me as well. And I still see that. I like to develop community. I like to be engaged in the communities where I live in. And I prefer to write with other people, like write in collaborative, present in collaborative ways. And so that element of creating your own communities, but also sort of giving back to community, however you're defining that for yourself, was what I learned from them too.
Well, I've heard your story a few times, Sonja, and I'm always inspired by it. And I want to know a little bit more about how all of this kind of shaped and informed the actual chosen path of your work, your actual work that you do. Because, you know, obviously it's very clear from what you just described that your upbringing and your family has been a strong influence in shaping who you are. But the idea of getting an education, you could have gone in many different directions, right?
Yep.
And you've chosen to spend a significant portion of your time and writings on issues related very closely to what you experienced yourself. And so I was curious, why is that important to you and why did you choose that path?
Yeah, so I think my understanding of going to college as a child, youth, high schooler, you know, all the things, was that you went to college for three things: doctor, teacher, lawyer. I didn't like blood and needles. Healthcare was out. I worked for the magistrate, like the town magistrate, which is basically like a lawyer of all trades, right? They do like everything. And he kept taking me into bankruptcy court. And I was like, this is not fun. Like, I don't want to do this for the rest of my life. So then law was out. And so that left me with education. And most of the people I knew, who in my hometown who went to college were one of those things, right? Like they were the doctor, the teacher, the lawyer. And so that left me with education. And I sort of was drawn to education anyway. My mom always tells stories of how I would like line up my stuffed animals and like teach to them. And so out of those three options, that one seemed the most viable to me. There were these stories about sort of how it was in some ways like a natural tendency for me. And so I majored in secondary ed as an undergraduate student and thought, I'm going to go teach history and be a coach because that's what I understood. That's what I enjoyed. That's made sense to everybody in my family, all of those sorts of things. But then as I sort of continued on and going to graduate school, which nobody, including myself, would have ever envisioned for my life, those pieces took me on a slightly different trajectory from PK-12 to higher ed. And as I applied for doc programs sort of later in my path, they ask you, what do you want to study? Like that's part of the application process. And so I thought, well, I want to study people who've had similar experiences to mine. And back in 2010, when I was applying to doc programs, not a lot of people were studying first generation college students. And so I wanted to explore that experience. Like institutions weren't as focused on that population yet. There wasn't a ton of publications on that yet. And then as I started getting into the literature to like figure out, well, what about first generation college students do I want to know? I started to realize, wait, people aren't studying students from rural areas. Wait, people aren't studying students from poor and working class backgrounds. I received a Pell Grant. I was a work study recipient. So those federal aid programs really were some of the reasons I got to go to college. I was on a state tuition program that Louisiana has called TOPS. And so I essentially was a beneficiary, right, of state and federal funding that allowed me to go to college. And so I was like, why is nobody studying these things? And some of it was studied quantitatively, but not sort of the in-depth experiences that people were having as they were trying to get to college in terms of access, as they were there in terms of sort of belonging and success and those sorts of things. And so I really was looking at how do I provide space for people to tell their stories, because those stories aren't currently being heard, or they're being told in monolithic ways that don't show nuance. And so once I started sort of on that pathway, essentially all of my research is either about an identity that I hold or an experience that I've had. And so I found other folks too along the journey who are like, hey, I identify this way as well. Let's work together. And so that I think has made our research richer. Folks like Dr. Becky Martinez and Dr. Kathy Guthrie and Dr. Georgiana Martin and a whole host of other people as well, who I think have added sort of depth to what we're looking at, why we're looking at it, and again, creating these platforms for people to share their stories.
Yeah, I was just going to say that your work, especially your work with Becky, has been obviously very influential. And your work was actually very influential in my work in higher education and working with first generation students when I was at Carthage College. A lot of your work on rural first gen students really helped shape a First in the Family program that we put together there. And so really, really grateful for all the work that you've been doing. And it's absolutely made a difference and been influential.
Well, and I appreciate that, Roger, because for me, the reason to write and do research and publish stuff is that it's useful for people, right? That it's actually going to be implemented by practitioners who are the ones who are actually doing a lot of the sort of student facing work to create pathways in, create successful pathways out. So people are earning those credentials. And so I appreciate that. I thank you for saying that, because to me, that's the point. It's not the number of citations. It's not the quote unquote impact factor. It's the true impact that it's having on people's lives.
I would love to hear a little bit more, Sonja, because, I think to your point, we research, or we want to find ourselves connecting with and around people whose stories match ours in some way, shape, or form. And so I'm curious, as a first generation college student, how, when you look back now, what was your experience like? How was it defined differently, potentially from some of your peers?
Yeah, so I think, a lot of my high school peers had similar sort of life circumstances to what I did. Not everybody did. We had a couple folks whose parents didn't go to college, those sorts of things. But I went to sort of a rural K-12 public school. I graduated with 23 people, right? So you're looking at smaller sort of populations there. And our high school counselors, while they supported us in the ways that they could, they had a million things on their plate, right? So, I think now I have friends who are college counselors at like private high schools in big cities across the US. And sort of their entire job is to work with a student to say from their sort of freshman year in high school, where do you want to go to college? Why? And then crafting in a high school experience to get them wherever they're trying to go, right? Whether that is University of North Carolina, Wilmington, because they want to surf and be on that, whether it is Harvard, whether it is, University of Montana, wherever it is. Nobody was doing that for us, right? Like they didn't have the resources and capacity. And so, when we asked for something like, oh, I need the application for this, they would hand it to us, right? But other than that, we weren't sort of getting that one-on-one curation of experiences. And so in a lot of ways, sort of we had to hustle. And that was for me, from a financial perspective, I was like, I have to qualify for this top scholarship. I have to fill out my FAFSA, even though my dad doesn't want to give me these tax.
Thank you for listening to the Culture Stew podcast. In a world full of podcasts and endless choices, we're especially grateful that you spent time with us.
Culture Stew is produced by MSM Global Consulting and hosted by me, Maria Marukian.
And me, Roger Moriano, with operations support by Melissa Gratz.
Are you interested in learning more about Culture Stew and MSM Global? Sign up for the Culture Stew newsletter at www.msmglobalconsulting.com. And send us your stories and questions at our email, culturestew@msmglobalconsulting.com.
And please remember to give us a 5-star rating and review on your favorite podcast platform.
See you next time.